Well, thank you very much for that very warm welcome. My name is Joe Gary, and I'm delighted to welcome you to Broadway Buzz, the opening of an incredible season, Motown, the musical. You know, this musical is full of so much joy, so much energy, so much sparkling spirit that it pulls you back to the 1960s and 70s. This, of course, Motown created a sound in music that has never really been copied. It transformed popular music into an idiom that has been extraordinary and received with great warmth literally everywhere in the world. This is a show that is really about Berry Gordy. Berry Gordy in 1959 was a 28-year-old African American who had served in the Korean War, who had worked for several years in the Ford assembly line in Detroit, Michigan, who had opened a record store that failed. But he had this incredible dream, and his dream was to make a new sound in music, and a sound in music that would transform the way we accept popular music. This would affect how the music was written, who it was written for, how the groups were developed. He started with young, unknown kids from the projects in Detroit. It was his pledge to turn them into international superstars, which is exactly what he did. He created this incredible new sound in music that would open the door to popular music from the 60s to the present. It had a level of sophistication. It had a level of musicality that was extraordinary. So in so many ways, he would literally redefine the whole process of the music industry. All this from someone who really only had a dream. He didn't really have a music education. When he met young people, he'd say, listen to the radio. That will give you your education. And it's obviously what he did with such distinction. Keep in mind, Berry Gordy, who created Motown, decided in 2012 that it was time to conquer Broadway. Keep in mind, by this point, Berry Gordy had conquered the music industry. He had stepped into the movie industry. The first movie that he created was a movie he created for Diana Ross, Lady Sings the Blues. It was nominated for 5 Academy Awards. That's a very prestigious way of stepping into the music industry. In case of music, keep in mind what he did. He created 525 major albums. 180 songs were #1 internationally in pop music. So this is an extraordinary man. So aside from conquering music and Hollywood, he also conquered television. Keep in mind, in the 60s and 70s, he took his groups that were exploding and would develop major television shows that would always sweep the Emmy Awards. So now here he is in 2012, a rather elderly gent by this point, but he hasn't yet conquered Broadway. And so it was his idea to take the body of music from Motown and create a musical. And again, what better way to do it than to focus on himself and his journey. So the protagonist of the show you're seeing is really Berry Gordy. It's written by Berry Gordy. It's based on his autobiography, To Be Loved. Nobody wanted to be loved more than Berry Gordy. And lo and behold, when the show opened on Broadway, keep in mind the producers were fighting with him, saying, we really should have someone else writing the book. And he said, who else knows more about Motown than I do? And so the end result was he created this sparkling musical that really is a story not only of his life, but of the development of Motown. Keep in mind, it is so successful, it's still playing to standing room only in New York. It paid back its $18 million budget, I think in a very record-breaking time. He decided to open the show and take it on the road. In the first 16 weeks on the road, it generated $20 million. So Berry Gordy knows what he's doing. Listen, he started with Motown borrowing $800 from his family. When he sold it for $61 million. A few years later, they sold the catalog of 15,000 songs from Motown for $330 million. So I'm going to put all my investments in Berry Gordy's hands, you know. Okay, but let me go back to the beginning and show you this incredible evolution. I mean, this is really an Horatio Alger story. You know, this young man who didn't have a high school education, who really had not found any focus in his life through his first 28 years, would suddenly come upon this idea that would transform music. In order to talk about that, though, I really have to go back a little further and talk about the Gordy family. Now, his family traced their roots to slavery. They're very proud of the fact that they've kept a sense of nobility and dignity, even though there wasn't money in the family. They're very proud to say they can trace their bloodline back to President Jimmy Carter's mother's family. So Jimmy Carter's mother's maiden name was Gordy, and so they traced their family lineage back to that family. And like many blacks in the South in the late 1920s, there was that phenomenal black migration where people moved from the oppression of the South, not only because of the civil rights restrictions, but also just to have a better life and a better education. And so they joined that group of black people who fled the South, moved to northern cities. In the case of the Gordys, they moved to Detroit. Of course, there were factories there. In the case of Detroit, they were car factories. And so people could get legitimate jobs and make a living to support their family. The Gordy family believed in several basic principles. Number one, to always be true to the family. And keep in mind, the family would meet every week. They still do, but they would meet every week, and at the beginning of the family's development in Detroit, every family member, if they had a job, had to contribute $10 to put in a fund. And the fund would be used only if a member of the Gordy family wanted to buy a car, start a business, buy a house. They would borrow it from the family rather than from a bank. The other things that the family stressed, aside from the power and unity of the family, was the idea of education. And of course, this is what made America great, these values that we had, the value of the family, the value of education, the value of the family staying together at all costs. Keep in mind, when Berry Gordy sold his business, all of his family members were still actively involved in the business. The last check that was written by his mother. She always had to co-sign every major check. So the moral of this story is, let your mother write the checks. That's it. So that sense of family stayed together. And what was so compelling about it was, as these young artists came into Motown, these kids who came from the projects, who came from broken families and all kinds of desperate backgrounds, suddenly found the first family they ever had. And that family literally stayed with them through all of their careers. And even the major stars would still call, you know, Berry Gordy's father, whom everyone called Pops, would call him from the road saying, "Pops, I need advice." So that sense of family always stayed together. Okay, so the family would very strongly impact Berry Gordy. And as I told you, everyone in the family believed education was important. That is, everyone except Berry Gordy. Now, Berry Gordy, when he was in high school, dropped out of high school to the shock of the entire family. No one in the family would speak to him. And he wanted to become a prize fighter. And the reason he wanted to become a prize fighter is, he said, in his youth, the only thing that made him proud of being black was what happened in sports, and especially what happened with Joe Louis when he won the world championship. And so for Berry Gordy, this was not only a triumph for the black race, but it led him to believe that he wanted to do the same thing. He wanted to become the master in some form so that the world would recognize him despite color. And of course, this is exactly what he did. He has become the most important African-American entrepreneur in America, and has made literally billions of dollars for people. An extraordinary career. I just want to tell you a lovely little thing about the boxer. In real life, He so loved Joe Louis that when he made all this money with Motown, Joe Louis used to represent Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas. And if you remember, if you went there in that period in the late 50s or 60s, Joe Louis was always there to greet you. And so it was a reason to go to Las Vegas to meet him. And Americans so loved him. And Berry Gordy, after he made a lot of money, would fly to Las Vegas in his private plane, would scoop up Joe Louis and take him out for one of the most extraordinary nights of his life. And that would continue every time he ever went to Las Vegas. So his idol remained his idol all his life and would be the model that he would use to come into his own. So when he left school and wanted to be a boxer, he very quickly learned that boxers suffer a great deal, and he started seeing all these middle-aged men with brain damage and faces that had been disfigured by boxing. The thing that Berry Gordy loved most in his life was women. And he realized that women were not going to like a bashed up face. So he left, I mean, this is not a very esoteric reason to do it, but he left boxing for that reason. But he did keep his love for women all the rest of his life. He was married 3 times, had 8 children, and innumerable affairs and dalliances and indiscretions literally all over the world. So he was a very colorful, remains a very colorful figure. Okay, so he borrowed this $800 from his family. He bought a little house in Detroit. You can visit that house. It's a museum now, and it's called Hitsville, USA. And when you see the house, you're so blown away by the idea of how tiny and modest the house is. It's just a little middle-class family house. And he moved his wife and child to the 2nd floor in 1959. He took the basement and turned it into a sound studio where musicians would record the music. Keep in mind, it would be the greatest sound that ever happened, and this was happening in a basement, you know, with blankets on the walls. And then he had the actual studio, the studio where the engineers would work, in the garage. And then sometimes singers would sing in the stairwell or upstairs, and no one was allowed to flush the toilet when a song was being recorded in that house. So it was an extraordinary beginning. But right from the very beginning, Berry Gordy had this phenomenal idea that Hollywood used. And sadly, this is not a major part of the musical you're seeing. You see it more by example rather than by articulation. I mean, watch very carefully the young girls who come and see how they become the Supremes and Diana Ross. It's beautifully done in the show. But actually, how this happened at Motown, Berry Gordy was so impressed by what happened at the Ford Motor Plant. He always remembered that a bare frame would come in, and by the time it left the assembly line, it was a beautiful car. And that's what he wanted to do with his artists. He brought in these young kids who had 2 things. They had a burning dream, and they had a powerful talent. And he was able to take that raw talent and turn it into a Rolls Royce. And he did this by having a kind of school where everyone who came to him had to do classes in movement, classes in voice, classes in harmony. They taught everyone how to sit. They taught them table manners. He said, I mean, keep in mind how outrageous this was for a 28-year-old kid. First of all, he has that sign outside the house that says Hitsville, USA, and he starts with nothing. I mean, he doesn't even have enough money to record the first song. But at the beginning, he understood that his idea would be prophetic, and it wouldn't be arrogant, it really would be visionary. It's exactly what he would do. So he would take these kids, find very excellent teachers to prepare them to, he literally said, I want you to be comfortable meeting royalty and presidents. And of course, that's exactly what happened. I mean, remember, Diana Ross was received by the Queen of England, and I'm sure she remembered all the manners she had learned at Motown. And Michael Jackson was hosted at the White House, and of course, the same thing happened. They all were taught all of this behavior, manners, how to move on the stage, how to get on the stage, how to exit, how to take bows gracefully. And the other irony was, he didn't turn, this wasn't like mass production. Every group was treated individually. so that the Contours were not like the Supremes and the Temptations were not like the Four Tops. They each had their own manner, their own technique, their own delivery. He was not creating plastic, he was creating gold. And he did this very seriously through all of their careers. And he also felt very responsible, not only for dressing them, choosing makeup, choosing clothes, choosing behavior on stage. Everything was covered. And so in this way, he really created stars, the way the old Hollywood system worked. I mean, it's an extraordinary commitment to do when you're a young fledgling company where every penny counts. But probably the most important thing, aside from his brilliance at spotting talent, was this incredible ear Berry Gordy had. I mean, when you listen to the show tonight, I mean, you'll be dazzled by, you know all the music, and you'll be delighted by it, and the staging is spectacular. But listen carefully to the music, because it's really the music that gave Motown its place in the world. Berry Gordy went around Detroit and he found the best jazz musicians. And keep in mind, Detroit in the 50s was very rich in little clubs where music happened, just as Cleveland was. Cleveland had a phenomenal host of wonderful sources of musical entertainment in the late 50s and early 60s. And in this case, Berry Gordy went around and picked the best of the best, and he created a little group that he called the Funk Brothers. Now, there is both tragedy and delight in the telling of the Funk Brothers story. They are on more records than the Beach Boys, the Beatles, Elvis Presley. They are the most celebrated band in the world, and yet no one ever knew who they were. When Berry Gordy promoted the material, he always promoted the singer. And so it was always Diana Ross and the Supremes, or Smokey Robinson and his group. It never focused on the musicians, and yet that's where the incredible sound came from. There is a brilliant documentary that I really recommend that you see that's called In the Shadow of Motown, and it sort of traces these forgotten men. They were always paid scale, but people made millions of dollars, and they were paid scale to perform. And literally, they would work sometimes 24 hours round the clock. It became such a factory that records were recorded literally 24 hours a day. And these men worked endlessly. It's a very, very powerful story. Jamie Jamerson was a great bass player, and that's one of the secrets of the sound of the Motown music. Listen very carefully to the melodic bass line and what happened in the electric bass and in the electric guitars and the string instruments. They created this rhythmic sound that so pulled you into the music that long before Diana Ross could seduce you with her charm and brilliance, you were already taken in by the sense and rhythm of the music. So, keep in mind, the Beatles, at the height of their career, came to America wanting to meet the greatest bass player ever, who was Jamie Jamerson, but his name went really unknown. And the same thing was true with the great percussionist. His name was Benny Benjamin. And again, he could create this very strong rhythm that pulls you into the song, that carries you through the song. But then he would do all these licks, all these improvisations in the beat to change the tempo. So you were beguiled by the rhythm that was going on in it. And this gave us the Motown sound. But keep in mind, I do want to stress that Berry Gordy was the one who really manufactured it. He was always there in the studio. And he was the one who would say, let's add tambourines on the backbeat. Let's add hand clapping. Let's add singing back the lyric line with the backup singers. I mean, he was the one also who could take these brilliant artists who were really trained in jazz and was able to find this new popular sound that would make the music, just soar. Now, one final sad story. Motown in 1972 finally moved from Detroit to Los Angeles. And the reason for that was, by this point, Motown had become so incredibly famous, and all of the stars had become iconic by this point, They moved to Los Angeles because Berry Gordy was interested in developing a movie career for Diana Ross. And the sad story is that when the Funk Brothers went to the studio one day, there was a sign on the studio door in 1972 that said, "Motown has moved to Los Angeles." And that was the first time they knew about this. I mean, this is a terrible story. Obviously not in the musical, but there could be a musical about this. It's a stunning story of being anonymous. And ironically, when this video was made in the shadow of Motown, people were really, people who had been fans of Motown were really so outraged at themselves, really, for saying, why didn't I ever ask who the drummer was, or who the bass player was, or who that brilliant pianist was? And so finally, at least they had their moment of, as Andy Warhol would say, their 15 minutes of fame in that brilliant video. So I do recommend that you look at it. So we do know now that Berry Gordy is a genius from the standpoint that he recognizes talent, he knows how to develop the talent, he creates a new sound in music, he's very hands-on. I mean, he so over-edits the music. I mean, they will do 90 takes of a song because he owns the studio. And the upkeep is not tremendous, in that little house. And so the end result is he created this magic that happened. And of course, then we would have this litany of great stars. The last great group that he would develop before Motown sort of faded was a group of young African-American artists named the Jackson Five. And of course, it would be Michael Jackson who would become his ultimate superstar. So if that's going to be the last act you discover, what a way to go out of the business, with the best. Okay, so you're in for a very special treat with the show. It's the wonderful cavalcade of the creation of Motown through, its demise. Now, Berry Gordy does something very clever in the musical that I want you to notice. The musical opens with the 25th televised anniversary tribute to Motown. This really happened in 1983. And all of the stars came back to honor Berry Gordy. But it was a very bittersweet time. I mean, keep in mind, by this point, by 1983, Berry Gordy is the most celebrated music producer in the world. Motown is the hottest record label in the world, and all of these groups that he created are now international superstars. But what happened in the process is other record companies lured them away, more money lured them away, and so the end result is it's a very bittersweet moment in Berry Gordy's life because, number one, groups are coming back that haven't been performing together. Diana Ross went off and had a solo career, signed a $20 million contract, leaving behind the Supremes. They came back and were reunited in this television show. Michael Jackson came back to be reunited with the Jackson Five. It was an extraordinary and historic television program. It swept the Emmy Awards, and it was really an ultimate tribute to Berry Gordy. But at the same time, he had to be there saying, these are the people I made, but these are the people that left me, and these are the people that are now jeopardizing the future life of Motown, because by this point, having moved to Los Angeles, the overhead expenses are so expensive there, the whole record industry changes, it's international conglomerates, and so Berry Gordy is in a very difficult financial position at that time, and ultimately he would have to sell Motown. But it's an extraordinary story, and what I want you to look for, one of the things that happens in the show that's so delightful, they have these little scenes that are called quality control. And really what they were the engineers, they were the writers who would gather every Friday, and they would bring little demo records of what they had worked on. Keep in mind, Berry Gordy was so specific that he would have particular writers write for Marvin Gaye, or he would have particular writers write for Diana Ross, or he would have particular writers write for the Temptations. And so they would come in and play their work every week, and the group would vote on which songs would be released. So it was an extraordinary way of working. It was a very democratic way of working. There's no other example in any of the arts. I mean, Berry Gordy was really the monarch of Motown, and yet he allowed this sort of democracy to happen, where he would submit songs that he wrote, and his his employees would thumbs down, turn it down, saying not good enough, go back and keep working on it. And so it was an extraordinary period of remarkable creativity. And even though, there have been countless lawsuits at Motown, and writers are suing Berry Gordy, and Berry Gordy is suing artists, and there's enough litigation to keep, a whole country of lawyers working for 10 years. But even though all that went on, it still never really interfered with this quality of we are family. And that idea of the democracy, of everybody voting on it and being part of the process, not only of making themselves great, but making Motown great, was very important. When you watch the show tonight, I'd like you to be very aware of how this story is told. So we know it begins with this 25th anniversary tribute that was done on television. I do have to pause and tell you a terrible story. It's not in the musical, but I can't resist sharing this story with you. And it was a magnificent, monumental event when the 25th anniversary tribute happened on television. But the real story behind it is Diana Ross was so obstreperous that when she went to sing with the Supremes, they kept moving up so they'd be in the same plane with her, and she would elbow them and move forward. Now, they didn't show it live on television. It was played on tape. So the only real tape of what really happened at that event is in Berry Gordy's safe, and I just hope someday he will release it. In the final moment, when all of the artists are walking downstage, you see it beautifully done in the show. But in real life, what happened was Diana Ross didn't want to be on the same plane as everybody else, so she ran up stage and stood on a high platform, so she was featured. So. This is show business, what can I tell you? But so that tape is somewhere, and I hope someday when Berry Gordy dies, we will really all see that real 25th anniversary. You see it wonderfully done in the show, but I just want you to know that there's this little subtext to the story. And the other thing I want you to be aware of is the mounting of this show. Only Berry Gordy, who knows the body of that music so brilliantly because he helped create it with all these artists. The show has 66 songs, or segments of 66 songs. And keep in mind, most musicals you see 10 songs in the first act, 9 songs in the second act. You've got 66 songs going on here. But they're so wonderfully presented, and they're put in such an organic way that the songs tell the story, Berry Gordy's story. And it's so cleverly done in such a very sophisticated musical way. So listen to those wonderful segues as you move in and out of songs and as you move from group to group. The show begins with a moment that's very Berry Gordy-ish. In real life, Berry Gordy used to send his groups out on tours, and he would have them compete. And one group would compete against another, and the more applause they got, they'd be placed higher in the ranking of the show until you closed the show and you were the superstar. So watch how they do that at the opening of the show. You see that little idea. Berry Gordy's idea was competition breeds champions, and that's exactly what he's done, both in the telling of this musical and in the way he developed this whole story. So you've got these 66 songs that are told in a very compelling visual way. It's dazzling. The scenes move wonderfully. Notice the incredible scenic ideas. They use these poles that are both horizontal and vertical, and they keep moving in and out to create proscenium arches, the frame of a house. Wonderfully imaginative and brilliantly done. They use spectacular projections that remind us of the incredible time that this was going through. This is the period of Martin Luther King and the Vietnam War and the hippie movement and the assassination of the Kennedys and Martin Luther King. This is a very tempestuous time. All of it is brought to life in this brilliant cavalcade. So it is my delight to tell you that you're going to have an extraordinary evening at Motown. Thank you very much.